The last video lecture for Chapter 4, we're going to discuss the helminths, or the parasitic worms. All right, the helminths include members that are tapeworms, so those are long worms that have flat bodies. The flukes, which are also have flat bodies, but they're shorter, and they usually have an end that's kind of tapered. And then the roundworms have a round, cylindrical-shaped body. Think like an earthworm. And now helminths are kind of like we talked about with fungi, that not all fungi are truly microscopic. Most helminths, the adult worms, you can actually see with the naked eye. Traditionally, though, if you were infected or infested, sometimes the term is infested when we're talking about parasitic worms. If you had worms living somewhere in your body, a lot of times that is diagnosed by the eggs that they produce. And these generally will have some part of their life cycle where they're living in your gastrointestinal tract, so you shed those eggs in your feces, and then a fecal smear is put on a slide and looked at under a microscope, and the eggs of different helminths have characteristic shapes and so forth that are useful for identifying them. All right, not all of your flatworms and your roundworms are true parasites. Some of them just live free living. They don't have hosts in the soil and the water. All right, a little bit more detail. The flatworms are part of a phylum. That's one of our classification levels. The phylum Platyhelminthes includes your flatworms. And the flatworms are divided into a group called the cestodes. Those are your tapeworms. And then the trematodes, that's another name for the flukes. And there are many different examples of these. Very thin bodies, and they're segmented. That means they're divided up into individual pieces or segments that essentially look almost identical. Then the roundworms, those exist in a phylum called the Helminths. And again, these are your nematodes. That's another name for those as well. Their bodies aren't divided up into segments like you see with the flatworms. They have cylindrical shaped bodies. So here's a diagram of a parasitic flatworm. So this would be a tapeworm type of parasite that you see here. And then over here, this kind of oval-shaped worm. This doesn't really, you wouldn't think that was a worm, but it is a type of helminth. And this is an example of a fluke or a trematode. So kind of an oval-shaped body, tapered at the ends. But if you looked at it from the side, it would be flat. Then here's a picture of a real tapeworm over here. So that usually grosses people out when they see those. Now one end is the head end, and also known as the scolex, and you've got several little suckers on there, and it uses that to latch onto the inside lining of the intestinal tract, and so it's going to feed off of the intestinal materials in the host where it's living. The flukes can live in different parts of the body. There are liver flukes and lung flukes that exist, so they're not restricted to the intestinal tract. Then here's a picture of some parasitic roundworms. And this one over here has a hooked tail, so this is likely an example of a hookworm. And so these have a round body shape, and you can look, they have organ systems, just like larger, more complex types of organisms. And at one end, there's a mouth. At another end, there's an anal opening. And sometimes they have these little spicules, hook-like features on the anal end. And if you're looking at a female worm under the microscope, you might look in there and see lots of eggs that are being produced and wind up getting shed by these worms. All right, what are some examples of helminths and how they get transmitted? A lot of them are transmitted through the fecal-oral route. So get used to hearing about fecal-oral. That'll come up a lot in microbiology. Those are things which are taken in orally through the mouth. You swallow them. They pass into your stomach. They're able to survive the acidic conditions of the stomach. And then they move on down into the intestinal tract, which is a much friendlier environment. You don't have a low acidic pH in your intestinal tract. And that's where they make their home. And that's where they do their feeding and their reproducing. All right, how about the nematodes? Again, these are the roundworms. So this is a table from your textbook that you can take a look at. Ascaris lumbricoides is the most common nematode parasite in the world. Causes a disease known as ascariasis. And actually, let me go back over here. This is not a hookworm. It's got the curled tail, but these are actually, I thought when I started talking about ascariasis, I was like, I think that picture on the previous page that those are ascaris roundworms. And they are. These are ascaris individuals. These are actually pretty long. We've got some preserved specimens on campus, and they're about that long. Usually the females are going to be larger than the males. So you do have males and females among your helminth worm parasites. All right, so if you have a female ascaris roundworm living in your intestinal tract, you're going to shed tons of eggs in your feces. And if you live in a part of the world where you have poor sanitation, those eggs get out into areas where people walk through fecally contaminated areas. You don't have good sanitation. And it's real easy. The eggs persist in the environment for a really long period of time, and it's easy for those to be transmitted. So ascaris is not a big problem in the United States anymore. It still exists in areas that are very rural, very poor areas with poor sanitation, but generally not a big problem in the United States anymore. Anaerobius vermicularis, that's the pinworm, and we'll talk a little bit more about those. Now that is a helminth that you're likely to see during your career. Those are pretty common in little kids. Trichinella spiralis is a type of nematode. Maybe you've heard of trichinellosis before. You can get that from eating improperly cooked pork. There's an immature stage of the worm that burrows into the muscle of pigs, and when you eat that, you can wind up developing a trichinella infection from that. So there are lots of examples of parasitic roundworms. Trematodes, these are the flukes, the kind of oval-shaped flat ones. Schistosoma japonicum is an example. That's a blood fluke. And that's not something you're likely to encounter in the United States, but you could have patients who come in from Asia with a schistosoma infection. That's called schistosomiasis. And there's an immature stage called a larva. So these helminths go through different stages of the life cycle, which you'll read about in the textbook. And schistosoma, there's an immature larval stage that penetrates the skin, and that's how it enters the bloodstream. How about your cestodes or tapeworms? Taenia is a genus that has a lot of members in it, and your pork tapeworm exists there, so you can pick those up from consuming undercooked pork. There can be immature stages of the worm living in the meats that you're consuming, and there also are tapeworms that live in fish as well. So consuming undercooked or raw fish, you can wind up getting a fish tapeworm infection from that. All right, so lots of different examples of these, and let's talk about the pinworm, because this is a helminth example that you're going to see that during your career in the health sciences in the United States. A lot of these helminths, you might very infrequently or never have a patient who has those, because we're privileged enough to live in a country with excellent sanitation, and so we do a lot of these. Many of these eukaryotic parasites that we're talking about are not as big of a problem in the United States as they are in other parts of the world. All right, so Anaerobius vermicularis, and this is one of those organisms we can tell something by its genus name. Enero refers to enteric, that's the intestinal tract. So that's letting us know where this worm lives. Pinworm, seatworm is another name for this. Lives in the large intestine, the colon. Only about 2 to 12 centimeters long, so maybe less than an inch to just a few inches long. Has kind of a tapered, curved shape. Now, what about the life cycle? What do these do? So how do you pick these up? So the eggs are shed in the feces and around the anal area. So, and it's gross to think about, but there's fecal contamination everywhere. People, use the bathroom, and maybe you touch things before you get your hands washed, and maybe people don't wash their hands properly, and so they're shedding fecal material all over the place. So it's everywhere. Pretty gross to think about, but it's true. The eggs of the pinworm hatch in the intestinal tract. When you swallow them, so you swallow these eggs because you've touched something that had fecal contamination on it, and they pass through the stomach and down into the intestinal tract, where the eggs actually hatch and there's an immature stage. So larvae is plural. That's an immature stage. So the helminths tend to go through multiple life cycle stages. It takes about a month for them to become adult worms. And you got some hanky-panky going on down in the intestinal tract where the males and the females mate. And then the female migrates to the anal area at night. You may have heard of that before. That's where she deposits the eggs. And then the eggs being deposited there causes intense itching, and little kids are itching. And if you think about it, if you're a worm and you want to get yourself transmitted from one host to another, that's a good thing to cause itching, because the little kids are going to dig around their anal area and pick up these eggs on their fingers and touch stuff, and then other people come along and touch those things and wind up picking up the pinworms as well. So they're very highly contagious. This spread very, very easily from one person to another. All right, so here's a picture from your textbook, so please be sure to take a look at that, because that's giving you kind of an overview of the life cycle of the pinworm. Here's the little kids playing with toys that have pinworm eggs on them, and that's how they're getting spread around. All right, another type of roundworm is Necator americanus. So it's a roundworm. It's going to be in the class Nematoda, a type of nematode. It's where all of your roundworms are grouped. And so hookworms, these two have a little hook at the neck area. I guess you would call it the neck, around the mouth. So this is a microscopic image of the mouth of a hookworm, and they really do look at it like this when you look at them under the microscope. We have examples in the laboratory here at Calhoun. And so this little opening is a mouth area, and those little jags you see there, those really are teeth. The teeth are made of chitin. Chitin is the same stuff that the exoskeleton, or the coating on insects and shrimp and things like that, is composed of. So here it's being used to generate teeth in hookworms. All right, so lots of these helminths have interesting life cycles. So what happens? All right, let's say you got a human who is infected with hookworms, and the hookworms are living in the intestinal tract. They're latched onto the lining there, and a female will shed eggs. The eggs come out in the feces, and they get deposited in if you're living in an area where you don't have good sanitation, they're going to wind up in the soil somewhere. And inside the egg, you have an immature form called a rhabdiform larva. And those convert or mature into what are called faleriform larvae. And those are in the soil. And let's say you're walking through the soil barefoot. The faleriform larva penetrates the skin. Now, these are tiny, almost microscopic, and you're probably not even going to realize that that's happened. But these larvae can penetrate through the skin. They enter the bloodstream. And this is where it gets interesting. They're in the blood. They migrate to the heart, and then through your pulmonary blood vessels that you learn about in Biology 202, they travel through those pulmonary arteries to the lungs, and they wind up burrowing into the alveoli in your lungs, the air sacs in the lungs. And then you cough them up, you exhale and cough them up into the back of your throat. And so they're there in your pharynx and the back of your throat. You swallow them, they travel through your stomach, they survive the stomach acid, and then they get down into your intestinal tract. And that's where they latch on with these, it's where they become adults and latch onto the lining of the intestine with those jagged teeth. And they're feeding, they're sucking your blood and so forth, living in your intestinal tract. All right, so Necator americanus. Necator is the genus of hookworm that likes to use humans as its host. Not a huge problem in the United States anymore, but again, there are these hookworms still do cause occasional infections, especially in areas where people might be walking around barefoot through contaminated areas where you have those larvae. So it's going to be associated with places with very poor sanitation. And last thing I heard, Alabama is the hookworm capital of the United States, so go Alabama. All right, there is a video link here you might want to take a look at. This is a link for a Monsters Inside Me video about hookworms, which is pretty interesting to look at. They've got some good graphics. Just to gross this out even more, here are some graphic pictures of Ascaris lumbricoides. So over here you can see the female worm on the left, male worm on the right, in relation to a penny. So they're a pretty good-sized worm. Imagine having those living in large numbers down in your intestinal tract. And this gross picture is coming from, it's like a piece of colon, and this person had so many Ascaris roundworms living in his or her colon that they had blocked. There was an obstruction, a blockage in the colon. They actually had to cut out part of the intestinal tract to clear that obstruction. These are pretty big, and the females are laying lots of eggs. If you look at the eggs under the microscope, they look like this. And if you use really good contrast and lighting, you can actually see the larva there on the inside. I'm tracing that with my cursor, and then out here you've got a multi-layered shell that's protecting the larva on the inside. But these are microscopic. That was probably, that image is probably at 100x total magnification, maybe 40. All right, a few more fun facts about Ascaris. So not a huge problem in the United States, but it is a major problem worldwide. We do want to be concerned about healthcare of people around the world. And at any given moment, probably about 1 billion or more people are infected with these, which is kind of scary. Population of the world is about 7 billion, so at least 1 in 7. Can grow to 30 centimeters in length. That's over 10 inches long, about a foot long. And notice this, the females release about 200,000 eggs per day. And so they are out in the soil where they're viable for long periods of time. All right. So Ascaris also has kind of a convoluted life cycle, and this one really seems kind of strange because the eggs you pick up fecal oral. So with the hookworm, the larvae actually hatch in the soil, and then they burrow through the skin, and that's how they enter the human body. With Ascaris, you wind up swallowing the eggs, and the eggs release the larvae in the intestinal tract. And then the larvae actually leave the intestinal tract. They enter the blood. The blood carries them to the heart. The heart pumps them through the pulmonary arteries into the lungs. And they get into the alveoli, the air sacs in the lungs. And they go through 2 more stages. They're morphing around in there. And then you cough them up into your pharynx, the back of your throat, swallow them, and then finally the adults develop in the intestine. So that's kind of interesting. You swallow the eggs wind up initially in the intestinal tract. There's a first stage larva that comes out of the eggs, and that burrows into the bloodstream, travels to the lungs, and goes through 2 more stages there, and then you swallow that third stage back down into the intestinal tract, and that's where it matures into the adult. So why some of these parasitic worms have such complicated life cycles, I'm not sure. That's just the way that's just the way things are. So those were some examples of parasitic helminths, and you do want to review what we discussed about those. And there are a whole lot more of them out there. In many parts of the world where you don't have good sanitation, everybody's walking around with helminths. They're almost like part of your normal microbiota in a sense, whereas we are covered with bacteria. In some parts of the world, everybody's living with 1 or more types of worms as well. So interesting stuff. Anyway, that concludes Chapter 4. And so again, we just kind of hit some of the highlights in Chapter 4, so be sure you're using your study guide and your review activities and so forth to zero in on what you need to know before you go on to take the tests.